Hey everyone, I'm just back with our next lecture video on the Middle American realm. This is lesson 3, I think, in our syllabus or our blackboard. And a couple of things. One is I'm going to go through this a lot quicker than I have before. I know that the first couple of lecture videos have gone way over what I want them to be. So a lot of this is obviously in your textbook. So I'm going to let you rely on some of that, and I'm going to kind of skip over some of the slides during this and let you rely on your reading abilities to pick up all the stuff that I really don't cover in much detail. Another reason I wanted to make this a little bit shorter is because there's another video. You'll see that in your lesson and in your homework assignment, in the discussion question, the essay question. And that one's about 20 minutes long, and it is a PowerPoint presentation that I did on a trip that I took to Mexico in the summer of 2022 with our local group, a group called the Mammoth Cave Biosphere Reserve Region. That's a UNESCO designation. The United Nations, it's kind of a special designation for the Mammoth Cave general area, and I'm the vice chair of that group. And I went with some professors from Western Kentucky University, geology, and basically cave experts, karst scientists, and some employees from Mammoth Cave National Park. And we went down on an exchange trip with a university down there in their biosphere reserve. It's also very karst in nature, a little bit different capacity. I go over all that in that presentation, but I just wanted to share with you that experience. First of all, because it has everything to do with our cultural studies here about the realm in Middle America, but also a little bit of background on what you could do with science degrees, geography or geology, which I also teach geology courses. So it gives you a little background on the types of things that we do with these degrees that we get in these different disciplines. So let's get on to the Middle American realm. So Middle America is going to be part of a larger, what we call Latin American area in the Western Hemisphere. The Middle American, along with the next realm we're going to study, the South American realm, both of those together make up what we generally call Latin America. And the term Latin is going to come from the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. So what that means is most of these countries that we're going to talk about in these two realms, Middle America and South America, were colonized either by Spain or Portugal. Now, as we go through this PowerPoint, you're going to see, okay, in the Caribbean out here, which is the eastern part of the Middle American realm, you do have some other influences. You have some English, some Dutch, some French. You've got small pockets of all that out here as well. However, the vast majority of this area was Spain and Portugal. So we'll get into that more as we go through the presentation. So the Middle American realm, as I just mentioned, I'll go back a slide since this is a bigger map. So the eastern side of this is going to be your Caribbean, the Caribbean Sea and the accompanying islands, the Greater Antilles and Lesser Antilles. And then the western part of it's going to be what we call Middle America and or Central America. So Central America, as I learned it in school, was the countries from Guatemala down to Panama. And then Mexico was part of North America as a continent. Now in today's world, in our courses that we teach with regards to realms. So with regards to realms, Mexico's culture and their economies and everything is more closely associated with these other countries in Latin America than they are with the United States and Canada. Therefore, Mexico is part of the Middle American realm, even though it physically is on the continent of North America. So here are some of the topics that we're going to discuss, and again, I'm going to go through these rather quickly. In some instances, I'll probably stop and talk about some things a little bit more than others as we go through this. Here are all of our catchphrases and terms that you should know about as you read through this chapter. So the realm itself, geographically, it's kind of a wide realm. east to west. It's not really big north to south. Um, it's the second smallest of all the realms that we're going to study physically. The dominant country in this is Mexico. And as you probably all know by looking at this map and seeing some of these countries, tourism is a big economic factor in this particular realm. So again, here's another map that I pulled offline. This is a little bit closer up and really gives you a better idea of what these countries are. Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, and then you have the islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. So just a disclaimer, in my studies, my personal experience, the Middle American and the South American realm, I have traveled pretty extensively. I have not traveled that much in the Eastern Hemisphere of the world, but the Western Hemisphere, I have quite a bit of personal experience traveling these countries, and especially the cultures in these countries. Being a Spanish speaker and being married to a Peruvian, of course, I have been to South America and Peru a whole lot, but I've also traveled to several of these countries that we're seeing in the Middle American realm. So it's a small realm geographically, but as you can see by the population density map here on the right, it's a pretty heavily populated realm for its size. The vast majority of those people do live in Mexico in this realm, and again, I want to point out to you that these colors, they're darker in certain areas. This is a population density map, not a total population map. So this is showing you how many people per square kilometer, in this case, live on each of these little color schemes, each of these little dots. So even though you see this big glob of people living here in this area, and you look up in Mexico, and a lot of Mexico, it's kind of like the United States. There's a big part of it there's not many people in it at all, because the northern part of it, next the United States border, is going to be right in this area. It's a lot of desert up there, not very habitable for people. So you don't have a high population density there, but down here there's a higher population density, although here around Mexico City over to Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta, you have a whole lot more total people than you have down in these areas. Again, I just kind of went over. Excuse me. So here's a little bit closer view of that map. You see a lot of these islands have a lot of people. Again, that's density, not total population, but you see they're pretty densely populated as you look at these. And that has to do with livability. Again, going back to the environment. Is this place a livable place? Does it have a good foundation for cities, the climate, resources? All of those things apply to where people typically live. Now, Mexico is sort of an outlier in most countries around the world, because most countries, you have the majority of their populations, if they have a coast on the ocean, you see a higher concentration of people typically on the coast of countries. However, in Mexico, their center population is in the center of the country, even though they have a whole lot of coastline. In Mexico, but you see most of the people are concentrated in the Central Valley here, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. So again, I've already mentioned that the Latin America, that's kind of a term that goes with the Middle American realm and the South American realm. And just because we talk about Latin being Spanish and Portuguese does not mean that there were not other influences in the area. These are just the two dominant ones that are in those areas. So this statistic at the top, the border between North and Middle America, which is the United States and Mexico, it's talking about this border right here that I'm pointing to with my pointer. That's considered to be the longest contiguous border between two realms, land-based, because a lot of realms are continents or they're not contiguous with land countries. So it says that's the longest border in the world as far as the two countries go. Now, there are longer borders with realms, but the two countries, this is the longest. NAFTA, I'll let you read about that. The borderlands, kind of a transition zone up in this area between the North American realm and the Middle American realm. That transition zone has to do with culture, population, um, the ethnic diversity of that population. You're going to see this term maquiladoras. These are very prevalent along the border with the United States and Mexico. Um, we first started learning about these back in probably the 1980s is when this term became very popular. These are factories that you sometimes hear politicians talking about. Well, all of our factories are moving to Mexico. Well, this is what they're talking about. And this largely occurred back in the 80s and 90s, maybe early 2000s. It still happens some today. Don't think that it doesn't. But there was a big surge of that back in those days. And, politicians, and I've mentioned politics before, and I'm not trying to preach one side or the other, and I never attempt to do that. But we have to talk about those kind of things because they are pertinent in our lives. And you're going to learn things and hear terms in this course that you're going to think, well, that's not what so-and-so said on the news, or maquiladoras are a product of capitalism. A lot of politicians want you to believe that Mexico is stealing our factories and taking our jobs. Well, this is pure capitalism. It was just cheaper to pay people in Mexico to do the jobs than it is to pay Americans to do the jobs. Therefore, these companies would move their factories across the border to hire Mexican laborers. So that actually has become, it was a big political point back in the day. It's not as much anymore. You don't hear about it quite as much anymore. Um, but it's a big component of the Mexican economy today, in addition to tourism. So our border zone with Mexico, you hear about this every day on the news. You hear every political candidate talking and whining and crying about it. I talked about it a little bit back in the first lesson, or the second lesson, excuse me, on North American realm. Um, we need to fix our immigration system. Both sides need to fix it, not one or the other. Both sides come at it from a different way, a different angle. And like I said in the initial, or the North American realm lesson, we need immigration. We need immigrants to come to this country because our birth rates versus our death rate is not high enough to sustain a growing population. Therefore, we need immigrants. So we need to fix the immigration so that we can do it the proper way, and we get away from some of these problems that we're having, like you see on this page here. The drug trafficking and organized crime is a pretty bad thing around our border. It might not be as bad as you're led to believe by some of the news outlets and some of the politicians. However, it is an issue. Most of our drugs, illegal drugs that we have in the United States, do come across borders from Middle America and South America. Now, how they do that depends on what you're talking about. In reality, most of the illegal drugs that come into this country, or at least a very, very good percentage of it, comes through legal ports of entry. It's not like it's possible for them to smuggle tons and tons of drugs in the middle of the desert across a boundary. That's just not practical. So most of it comes through ports of entry, either on that border or ports like Miami or Los Angeles, or somewhere where shipping comes to the United States and people take it, even airports sometimes. So most of the cocaine eventually comes from South America, makes its way to our borders, again, either at a port of entry, or sometimes some do come across the border. I'm not saying that never happens, but it's just more practical to try to smuggle it through ports of entry. There's a TV show, I can't recall the name of it right now, and the whole TV show is based on people getting caught trying to smuggle drugs from other countries, people paying money trying to get them in the United States. So you got cocaine from South America. Marijuana is largely grown in Mexico, and of course, a lot of today's world. This textbook was written at a time, probably 5 or 6 years ago. Marijuana is becoming legal in more and more states here, and probably it's going to be legal in all states in the next probably decade or so. Just my guess. So the border fence, you see that actually started in 2006. There's a lot of problems with building a fence, and basically it doesn't work. It's a waste of money. Any fence that has tried to be erected on our border, it's been pretty much a disaster. People get over it or through it or under it pretty much anytime they want. But you can see here some of the other things that there's a lot of people that just get visas to legally come here and then they stay after their visas expire. A lot of that happens. I know a lot of people that actually have done that. And here you see a bulk of the illegal drugs are smuggled through ports of entry. I've already mentioned that. So let's jump now to the physical geography of Middle America. So the term isthmus, you see there, that's a narrow strip of land that connects two land bodies, a land bridge. And you can see here, you have North American continent up here and South America down here. So this is a textbook isthmus, a narrow, relatively narrow strip of land that connects two larger land bodies. So then you've got the islands, the Caribbean islands that we talk about. So you've got the Greater Antilles, which basically is your larger islands, and then you have the Lesser Antilles, which are your smaller islands out to the east that kind of border the Caribbean. And here's the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico's up here. Now, depending on your source, I'm just going to throw this out there right now. These are the Bahamas up here near Florida. You'll see some textbooks or maps put these with the Lesser Antilles because they're smaller and they kind of draw a band around here. Our textbook puts them with the Greater Antilles. The Bahamas are kind of unique in that they were English inhabited or colonized. They don't really have that Middle American culture. However, they are included in the Caribbean islands, so there won't be any specific questions on the Bahamas, but I just wanted to throw that out there in case you see sometimes they might be included in the Lesser Antilles. So let's go to the terrain and atmosphere a little bit. So Hispaniola, this is the island of Hispaniola, which if I go back is going to be right here. This island right here. So one of the larger islands in the Gulf of, or the Caribbean Sea, and it's split into two countries. You have the Dominican Republic on the east side and Haiti on the west side. So as you know, the Caribbean is Hurricane Alley. There's a lot of hurricanes that come in and just wipe some of those islands out at times, so that's a problem for them. Also in 2010, if you remember that, if you paid attention to the current events back in those days, which probably you didn't, but and you probably, some of you were probably too young even to even realize this, but there was a catastrophic earthquake that hit Haiti and pretty much just leveled all of our infrastructure. Most buildings are built with concrete in these countries, and it just leveled everything in Port-au-Prince, the primary city, the capital city there. So natural disasters are very common in these areas. Altitudinal zonation. We're going to talk about this both here in this realm and the South American realm, the next chapter as well. And what this is you have mountain chains that are very near the ocean. And these mountain chains, as you know, as you go higher in mountain chains, the climate and the temperature changes. When you get so high, you actually have snow. When I visited Peru, and you'll see some slides of this in the next chapter, we're pretty close to the equator, but I was high enough in elevation that there was snow on top of some of the mountains. That's because it's so high in elevation. But as you go up these mountains in a tropical climate, you've got different ecosystems at each elevation. So depending on how high your mountains are in any given location, you can see here how the climate differs and what they might use that for. Tierra Caliente is basically the warm climate. That's bananas. That's your tropics. That's the tropical rainforest, basically. That's where you're going to grow your tropical type crops. Tierra Templada. That's going to be a little bit cooler, a little bit more temperate. That's what templada means, is temperate. It's not going to be as hot as the rainforest, but it's a little bit moderate, probably similar to what we have here without the extremes. It doesn't get real hot or really cold, but kind of like it here is here and kind of in the fall and in the spring. So there you're going to get your coffee plantations. South America and Middle America are known for their coffee, corn, wheat, vegetables. As you go up, Tierra Fria, that's the cold climate. So that's getting up to 12,000, between 6 and 12,000 feet. So that's higher than the city of Denver at 6,000. Going up to 12,000, you're going to have potatoes, barley, wheat, dairy. You're going to have a lot of livestock up in this area. My wife, actually, her dad has livestock in the Andes Mountains in Peru, and it's up at this altitude here. And then you got Tierra Helada, which means frozen, and that is really cold, and you might have some livestock up there. It's not so cold that they can't have livestock. It's really not. They call it freezing. It's not really freezing to us. It's still normally above freezing, but a coolish climate, probably highs in the 50s, lows in the 30s, that kind of thing. And they have livestock up there. And then Tierra Nevada, that means pretty much nothing. It's barren because nothing can grow up there. And that's where we're going to have your snow caps. Very important. Again, here's a bigger drawing of that, a bigger resolution, so you can see this. You're going to have a few questions on this on your assignment, so make sure you kind of look over this and study this. And this kind of goes through what I just told you, so I'm going to just kind of skip through here. So tropical deforestation is a big deal in Middle America. Only 10% of the tropical rainforest that was originally here is still here, which is not a good thing, especially because Central America, from Guatemala down to Panama, is really considered a biodiversity hotspot. I've been to Costa Rica several times. It's beautiful. It's a paradise. It's just amazing, the biodiversity in those areas down there. A lot of, why do you have deforestation? You know, some of it, the timber's cut to sell, but some of it is just chopping down the rainforest to be able to grow crops. And when you have a population that's exploding and more people need more land to grow more food, you're going to have these forests cut down. And this is a very big problem in the world. This was the environmental problem when I was younger, probably when I was most of your age. Deforestation of the Amazon was a thing, and it still is a huge problem. It's still being cut at record rates, and it is a huge problem for climate change. Climate change has various inputs on why it happens and how it happens, but the loss of that vegetation it's carbon storage. As we cut it down and burn it and clear it, it's more carbon that's going into the atmosphere that's exacerbating climate change. So cultural hearth, you need to know that, the definition of what a cultural hearth is. Mesoamerica, you're going to hear this term sometimes. That's basically the tropical area between Guatemala, Belize, and Nicaragua, and the Yucatan Peninsula. You'll see the different, I have videos in our lesson on the Mayans and the Aztec. The Aztecs were more in the Central Valley of Mexico, where Mexico City is. The Guatemalan highlands was the center of the Mayan civilization. And the slideshow that you're going to see that I have for Mexico this past summer, we visited a lot of Mayan ruins when we were down there, and their biosphere is really centered around the Mayan civilization on the coast near Tulum down there. These cultures were responsible of the initial domestication of corn, sweet potatoes, cocoa beans, and tobacco. So, Spanish conquest of Middle America and South America, you're going to hear this twice in the next two chapters. Of course, they brought in our domesticated animals, farming, their layout of their Spanish towns. You're going to see Plaza there, the market square. They call it the Plaza de Armas in Latin America. That's kind of the center of the town. So if you're from a small town in Kentucky, think about your town square. That's the equivalent of their Plaza de Armas. They brought Catholicism with them, and of course the Spanish language. You'll see here on these maps on the next two slides, there are still big populations, big areas that people speak native languages. Here it's Mayan down here in these areas. in Peru, for example, it's Quechua. But when we were in Merida in the Yucatan, when you see on that video, I'm going to the PowerPoint that I'm going to show you in the other video. We actually were able to eat lunch with some traditional Mayan speaking people down there when we did one of our field days. Pretty interesting. So here we have the spheres of influence. So this is a map showing you who colonized what. Again, you have a little bit of British, Dutch, and French here. Haiti was actually French. Some British. You see Belize here was British. Belize was actually the only mainland Central or Middle American country that speaks English as a native language, and was basically owned by Britain until I think it was 1952. Later in the slide here. But you see here is who kind of, but these are, if you notice, these are all really small. So even though there's numerous ones of them that aren't Spanish or Portuguese, very small. Most of these islands now are so tourist oriented, they've lost a lot of that original culture other than the larger islands that you see here. You see the sugar trade was big. The United States, their influence later really spurred the banana plantation agriculture model in Middle America. And then you have a large African culture in Haiti and Jamaica, both. Here's Jamaica, here's Haiti. Of course, the reason for that is there was no African colonization here, but there were numerous African American slaves brought here, and there were so many brought to some of these islands that's the dominant population now. And so African culture is very strong in Haiti and Jamaica specifically, and some other parts of the Caribbean as well. So a lot of these countries, Mexico started with their independence in 1821, and then the other ones started following soon after that. We actually had a war with Spain in 1898. And that allowed Cuba to become independent, and Puerto Rico is still a commonwealth, a territory of the United States. So again, you're going to see the term mestizo. That means a mix of European and native cultures. So mestizo would be Spanish and indigenous in this case. That's going to be pretty common throughout Middle America and South America. And so a lot of these Caribbean islands, one thing I want to point out, so they're like paradise when you go visit them. You know, blue water, crystal clear blue water, you know, beautiful forest on the islands. A lot of them just, you think they're paradise, but actually they were very difficult to survive on. There's not a lot of resources needed to sustain a large population of humans. So that's why a lot of these countries, it's actually a little bit expensive to live in some of these things because they have to import a lot of their raw materials that they use on a daily basis. So the United States is the primary trader with most of these countries. And of course, that brings us to the tourist industry. So Middle America is huge on the tourist industry, both in the Caribbean, the islands, and the mainland with Mexico and Central America. So what are some problems with tourism? Well, first of all, some of the locals don't like it that much. Now, you might think, well, it brings a lot of money there. And I've seen this firsthand because I've traveled quite a bit there and in Peru, obviously. And it does, and it provides some jobs for the locals. They don't get paid very much. And as soon as you leave the resort areas, it's very, very difficult with regards to the poverty level. That's why in some countries, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, it's really not safe to even leave your resort in a lot of cases because the poverty is so strong in those countries, because even though they're bringing some jobs that they don't pay people hardly anything to do, most of the money is going to the Hilton Corporation or whatever resort you want to name. The money's going to them, and it's going out of the country. It's not going to the local people. Therefore, you have a lot of local resentment toward tourism in some cases. Again, you lose some local culture there. Um, so, economic integration. I'm not going to talk a lot about this. I'm kind of just reading through this as I'm talking here. Um, Again, I mentioned already the primary trading partner was with us, the United States, and really, this is kind of a personal observation. The United States, I think, have kind of taken the Latin American countries for granted over our history, because we're over here kind of on our side of the world, on the Western Hemisphere. And there's other countries now making inroads. That's why Cuba is closely associated with Mexico in the former Soviet Union. They wanted a country here close to the United States in our own hemisphere to base out of. So that's what happened with Cuba back in the day with Fidel Castro, who was a dictator. We'll talk about them here in just a few minutes. China is making inroads in South America right now, and a little bit in Central America. So even though we're their heaviest trading partner, sometimes they look at the United States as kind of like a bad older brother. They rely on us some, but they don't like it. And you'll see that sentiment sometimes in Latin America. You can read all about these trade agreements in your textbook. Here you have gross domestic product. This is just, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but you see the larger ones are going to be Costa Rica, Panama, and Mexico. They have the largest economies in these areas. And that has directly to do sometimes with tourism, sometimes with their connection to the United States. So the regions of this realm is going to be the Caribbean out here. You got the Greater Antilles, and you see on this map they actually include Bahamas and the Lesser Antilles going around here. It's in purple. So that's the opposite of what they had on the other map. So again, that's kind of a hit or miss, the Bahamas. The Greater Antilles are going to be your larger islands here: Jamaica, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and then Central America and Mexico. So you see they divide Central America and Mexico into two different regions because Mexico is different than the Central American countries. And here's just a better resolution of that same map. So you see Central America goes from Guatemala, Belize, all the way down to Panama here. And then here are your Greater Antilles, Lesser Antilles, and Mexico. So physiography, that means landscape. What we're looking at, we have Baja California. If any of you have ever visited or heard of Cabo San Lucas, the tourist resort, that's right here on the end of that peninsula. It's called Baja California. That means Lower California because California, the state, is right there, San Diego, so it's right under California. The Yucatan Peninsula, where I spent my time and my other presentation, is out down here. Cancun's right here. Cozumel, an island right here. Merida, the big city here, is right here. We spent some time in Merida as well. The Sierra Madres, the two mountain ranges. So it's kind of the same mountain range, but there's kind of two arms of those. So Occidental means west, Oriental means east. So this is going to be the Sierra Madre Oriental, Sierra Madre Occidental. And in between that is called the Plateau or Valley of Mexico. And that's where you had Mexico City. The heart of the Aztec area is through here. And then you have a drier desert-like climate in the northern part of it. But as you get south of Mexico City, along the Caribbean, and all down until you get to Guatemala and the Yucatan, you have a lot more precipitation. You have some rainforest down in these areas. Oaxaca, Acapulco is in this area. Acapulco was a huge tourist destination when I was younger. Not so much anymore because some of the gangs have taken over, the cartels. Here you have a little closer view of Mexico by itself and your population centers. You got Mexico City, Guadalajara here, Morelia. I spent 3 months all across this area right here from Guadalajara all the way out to Cancun and Cozumel when I was in college. So I've traveled this area extensively. A lot of it is unsafe right now because of the cartels and the gangs. It's unfortunate, but It's gotten kind of bad there. So you also see some of their natural resources. You see gas and oil fields down here on the coast, the Caribbean coast. That's where you're going to find those natural resources. In the mountains, obviously, you're going to see there's some gold, plus there are gold reserves down here you're going to find on the south side of the mountains where it's running out of the mountains. So be sure to look over the natural resource areas in Mexico. We'll have some questions on that for sure on your assignments. So again, here's your population map. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but it kind of gives you an idea where most of the population is centered. The Caribbean coast through Mexico City, and this kind of connection right through here over to Puerto Vallarta, Guadalajara, Leon. And up here you have a higher population just because of its nearness to Texas, right here in the United States. The maquiladoras that we were talking about earlier. So most people live in cities in Mexico, almost 80%. That's probably gone up just a little bit since this book was written. Here you have again, this map denoting where native languages are spoken. So again, agriculture, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. They have the communally owned farms, the ejidos, and you have your haciendas as well. That's all in your textbook. Maquiladoras, we've already mentioned this. The foreign-owned factories, you're going to have the majority of those are going to be up here along the U.S.-Mexican border. At this time, nearly 2 million people were employed at that time. The minimum wage there was raised to $5 an hour, which is not too bad for Mexico. Here it's not. You wouldn't think about that, but down there that was not too bad. Basically, you have a big difference in the northern part of Mexico versus the southern part when we're talking about resources, education, job availability. The south is much poorer, much less developed than the north is. Again, you have rougher terrain, you've got mountains, you've got rainforest. Not much accessibility down here. One thing I'll mention real quick here that you'll not see anywhere in your materials is there's a lot of controversy right now in the Yucatan Peninsula because, of course, up here in the northeast corner, you've got Cancun, Cozumel, Tulum, a lot of tourist attractions up here, so you got a lot of money up here. The president of Mexico is now started a project to build a train basically from Merida around to Cancun and going all the way down into Mexico and central Mexico toward Chiapas, the state of Chiapas. It's very controversial because his reasoning is he's going to have better access to that area to help it. Now that sounds great, but a couple of things. One is there's just not a lot of people down there anyway. The second thing is it's destroying a lot of Mayan cultural sites, the environment, the cenotes, the karst areas are being heavily damaged. It's a big deal down there in Mexico right now, and there's a lot of people really upset about that. It's called the Mayan Train, if you happen to see it on the news anywhere. So again, drug cartels have been big. They pretty much kind of reared their head probably in the late 90s to early 2000s. When I went back when I was in college a long time ago, back around 1990, it wasn't dangerous at all to go to Mexico. And in the late 90s to 2000s, it became very dangerous to go to Mexico. When I was young, it was Colombia that was very dangerous to go to because of the drug trade, and now Colombia is actually moderated, and it's better to visit now than it was then. So again, you've got a large share of South American cocaine that comes up through Mexico, through Central America. The cartels kind of ferry this cocaine through Mexico and bring it to the United States. They also deal in marijuana that's grown locally there in Mexico. It mentions some of the cartels here. Those change every other year, which one's strongest, which one's biggest. One thing you may have seen in the news recently, they recently arrested El Chapo's son, one of his sons that was down there. Kind of a big deal. They kind of had a big battle with the military down there in one of the cities and had to fly him out in helicopter and all this stuff. So it's gotten very dangerous in central Mexico. And here is a map from 2017 of the cartels and where the drugs are coming from and where they're going across the border. These are the primary routes. And here we're going to kind of zoom in on Central America. We have, again, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador. El Salvador is a country that is small. It has a high population density because it doesn't have much area. It doesn't have much in the way of an economy. It doesn't have a lot of money. It's always been rather dangerous to travel there because it's always been very unstable. And it just hasn't progressed the way of some of these other Central American countries. Panama at one time was kind of rough, but it's really, really gotten better in the last 2 decades. Costa Rica has probably been the most stable country in Central America in our lifetimes, in my lifetime. Very democratic country, very stable country. There's not a lot of political upheaval there. Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala all have been hot and cold with regards to political violence, drugs, gangs. Sometimes they'll go through a good phase, then they'll go through a bad phase. But those are the countries in Central America. And this is the Panama Canal, by the way. Right down here is Panama City. The Panama Canal runs through here. It's the gateway between the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the Pacific Ocean over here. So that was constructed in 1952. Don't quote me on that. I'll tell you in a minute. Again, you've got highlands. This is a very mountainous area, even though it's very thin with regards to a land bridge. There are mountains through the center, and then you have lowlands around the coast. I mentioned earlier, it's a biodiversity hotspot. Panama and Costa Rica especially are just exceptionally beautiful rainforest, cloud forest. It's really nice. Again, the narcotics trade, I've already mentioned this like 3 times. So Guatemala, the northernmost, or I guess Belize is a tad bit more north. It's upper arm here, but it's it borders Mexico. Guatemala and Belize both border Mexico. Guatemala has some minerals. It grows a lot of coffee. Traditionally, it's been one of the poorer Central American countries. A lot of mestizo, mixed population. A lot of indigenous populations still live in Guatemala. Those are native peoples. Belize, again, I mentioned this earlier. It's the only Central American English-speaking country. It was part of the United Kingdom or dependency on the United Kingdom until 1981. It's a little longer than I thought it was. The population is relatively small. It's becoming increasingly Hispanic. That means more people from these other countries are starting to go there. So you're hearing more Spanish spoken there. The culture, Latin American culture, is starting to show up there more than it was. It has a lot of plantations, a lot of seafood. One other interesting fact about Belize is since it was English-speaking after the Civil War, the American Civil War in the late 1860s, a lot of the southern plantation owners that did not want to remain in the United States because they lost immigrated to Belize. And they had a large American Confederacy population there for several years. Honduras, I'm not going to go through all these in great detail. You can read about these in your book. Again, they have some agriculture. They have some biodiversity there as well. But they've never really picked up on that ecotourism. Them and Nicaragua both have never really grasped and taken a hold of that tourism dollar like some of the other countries have. El Salvador, I mentioned that already, most densely populated. Panama, we've mentioned Panama. Panama and Costa Rica are two of the kind of the jewels of biodiversity. Has good uplands, good mountains, a lot of mestizo people, a lot of mixed people. They do have, them and Costa Rica both have some African American minority areas, and I visited some of those areas, and they do have certain areas that they have little towns and cities in, and that's where they live. I mean, it's kind of, you'd almost think segregated, but it's not because of government or anything else. That's where they settled, and that's where they live. And then you have a predominantly urban population, like in any other of these countries. The Panama Canal, I I said 50s. It was 1940 that it was actually completed. I misspoke on that. I was thinking about Belize. 1914 it was completed, but it was widened a few years ago. They had a project, I think in 17 or 18, that they widened it to take some larger ships. Because if you can't get through here, remember, you have to go all. If you're, say, on the East Coast, in Miami, and you were shipping something to Asia, you'd have to go all the way down around South America and back up to get for a shipping lane. But here, since they built this canal, you can just go right through the Panama Canal here, and that saves literally probably a couple weeks of sailing. You see here, 2016 was the expansion of the Panama Canal, so a year before I said, and that has led to an increase in our ports as far as receiving materials from other countries like Asia, like Japan, China, those areas over there. Nicaragua, think of it as a triangle. When you look, if you're trying to figure out what it is on the map, it kind of looks like a triangle right here on the northern border of Costa Rica. And again, it's one of those countries that's never really taken advantage of its natural biodiversity. Nicaragua has had kind of a rough past with politics and civil wars, and for my childhood back in the 80s, it was kind of a difficult place to be in. They had a pretty big civil war there back in those days. And they had some civil unrest back in 2018 that caused a large immigration of people to Costa Rica. You might see on the map here, you see this red dotted line. They have thought about putting a canal there. That was another canal in addition to the Panama Canal. It'd be a lot longer than the Panama Canal is. They would utilize this lake. They were thinking about doing that. The investors kind of backed off on that from China, and I don't think it's a thing anymore as far as the last time I read anything about it. And here we have Costa Rica. I've already mentioned Costa Rica. And I'm not going to mention these in detail because I'm already taking way too long on this than I thought I was going to. So the social pyramid, read about this in your textbook, the social stratification. You have certain hierarchies in these countries, and you'll find there, here in the United States, we have a lot of inequality. We have our racism. We have our class structure from poverty, from the poorest to the richest. They have the same types of things in Latin America. In Latin America, you see there's two big divides that I see more than anything. One is between rural and urban people. The urban people tend to think they're a little bit better than the rural people are. And the other thing that you'll see is the type of blood that you have, the ethnic mix that you have. The native people are on the bottom. They're looked down upon by what we call the mestizos, which is a blend of the Europeans and the native people. So you've got a few different angles on that to look at when you're thinking about the social stratification in these countries. I know my wife's family, they are from the high Andes, and when you go to Lima, Peru, they really look at those people as inferior, and it's bad. But we have these type of issues in the United States along racial lines or along ethnic lines, but it really happens all over the world. Wherever you go, you're going to have that type of prejudice, and it's very unfortunate. You do have a little bit of South and East Asian presence in some of these areas. Again, you're going to see that more along the western coasts of these countries. You'll find more of that in South America than you do Middle America, but it is prevalent in Middle America as well, in Mexico and some Costa Rica, Panama. So the Greater Antilles, again, I mentioned Fidel Castro earlier. He was a communist dictator, very closely tied with the Soviet Union. That's what Russia previously was. And I think Raul was his brother, took it over in 2006. And they were a thorn in the United States side for a number of years, for several decades. We just started diplomatic relations again with Cuba in 2015. So for several decades, we had no diplomacy with Cuba whatsoever. They traded with Russia more than they did with the United States. Cuba is the largest island in the Greater Antilles and in the entire Caribbean. It has a mountainous zone like many of these islands do, and you see their raw materials are limited, very limited. Tobacco, coffee, to rice, but they really don't have a lot of agriculture. It's a really, really poor country. But it's kind of been shut off. You don't hear a lot about Cuba because for decades, no news or anything came out of Cuba. You really didn't know anything about it. They were a communist society for a number of years. I would tend to believe they still are a communist society, but they're no longer as attached to Russia and some of the countries that they previously were. Jamaica, native language English, Afro-Caribbean population. Again, that African influence from the slaves that were brought over. They used to have a huge bauxite mining operations there, but they've really dwindled. They've exhausted that resource. You can see they're tropical climate, so they have bananas, sugarcane. Haiti, I've already mentioned that. This is Hispaniola. Haiti's over here. Dominican Republic is over here. The hurricane or the earthquake that I mentioned earlier, numerous hurricanes have hit. Not a lot of natural resources there. It's a very, very poor country. Dominican Republic's on the east side of that island. It's a little bigger, has a little bit bigger mountains, a little bit bigger population. It has some more biodiversity. It has a little bit more resources than Haiti does. But again, it's still a very poor country and really depends on tourism to bring money into the country, even though that country does not get nearly as much a percentage as it probably should and wants to get out of the tourism industry. Puerto Rico, interesting fact about Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They were a Commonwealth/territory of the United States. In 1952, they became the Commonwealth. And they're an interesting topic right now because they've had several votes in recent years voting on gaining statehood, becoming a state, the 51st state of the United States. That has passed the vote in Puerto Rico the last two times that I know that they've had the vote by a slim margin, but it did win. But so they're U.S. citizens. They have to pay taxes. They have to kind of go by our rules because they are a Commonwealth of the United States. However, they do not have representation in Congress. To do that, they have to become a state. So they are governed by our government, but they don't have a voice in our government. And even though they have voted to become a state, U.S. Congress has not really taken a step to make that happen. And as you can imagine, it's political. One side does not want it, one side does want it. And the whole basis of it is what they think Puerto Rican people, which party they think they will vote for. One side does not want the other side to have two more senators than they do in the next election. So they don't want Puerto Rico to become a state. And that would reverse if the other party was like, it's just a back and forth. So really not much progress has been made on that. But again, gets hit by hurricanes pretty regularly. In 2017, they had a huge one. And at that time, our government was not exactly concerned about Puerto Rico that much. I'll just leave it at that. And to not offer them the assistance that they would any other U.S. state, even though Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth of the United States. And there have been some hard feelings about that in Puerto Rico and in the Latin community since then. Here's some of the Lesser Antilles. I'm not going to go through these. You can read about those in a textbook. I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible. So, that's it for the presentation. If you have any questions, like always, feel free to let me know. And any help that you need at all, reach out to me because I don't know what's going on unless you let me know what's going on. So I don't hear a lot from y'all recently since we got all the kind of initial first week kinks worked out. So hopefully everybody's doing well. But if you need any assistance with anything, feel free to let me know. Thank you.